it away, Doctor.
I will start, but we are going to operate in the dialogue format since the book that we've written is a collaboration. And
I'd say it's a nice way of saying this is going to be a Laurel and Hardy routine. What's happening with this Stella book? So keep your expectations low.
just a little bit of background, as you very kindly mentioned at the beginning. I started out studying Greek sports in connection with Greek drama, looking at things like athletic metaphors and disputes within the drama, and trying to read those in terms of combat sports. And at that time, in the 90s, I was vaguely aware of what later became mixed martial arts. There were videos that you could rent from the local VHS shop. And occasionally on television, late at night, you might see things like kickboxing, that kind of stuff. But I really couldn't do much else at that point other than add a footnote to the book that I had noticed these things, and I thought that they might be relevant to this kind of study. In the passing 2 or 3 decades, I did occasionally run across students who were practicing combat sports, and I would talk to them and maybe get a few details here and there. But I was never really able to pursue the idea that the Greek pankration in particular might be still continuing in a form probably associated with mixed martial arts. I'd never really heard of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu until about 8 or 9 years ago, when we had a couple of students who were both rivals in town, and they would talk about their exploits. And again, I picked up a few bits of information here and there. And then just before the pandemic started, I was looking for a research assistant to help me with agonistic elements in Greek poetry. I had met Joshua very accidentally at an event on Irish poetry. We talked about this helping me look at the anger and conflict in poetic activities among the Greeks. And I mentioned in passing, I used to work the same sort of things in sports, but that's kind of being locked away. And he said something like, well, I think I can help you with both of those, because I don't only write and study poetry, but I also combat sports. And out of that rather casual conversation, our book has grown. And indeed, I have to give him credit, because most of what is in here actually arises from his perspective. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Much against my own will, I should say. Yeah, I didn't want to make it autobiographical. So,
well, the reason it's a sort of autobiographical study is that when we were writing up the chapters, I noticed that his writing was much more interesting than my dramatic scholarly style.
that I will agree.
And I said, you should really write this up yourself, and then I will add these pieces that relate to Greeks. So we came up with the idea of the sort of Odyssey, because as you'll see today, the figure of Odysseus is quite important for us.
And the key too, that this whole process has been a kind of mimicking of the combat sport that we're talking about most prevalently, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but combat sports in general. And we'll get into that later about how it's dialogic, Socratic in nature. And so that's the origin of the project, and that's been the completion of the project. And so all throughout, it's been a series of conversations that gradually, thankfully, turned into a book. So,
yes, I'm happy to pass a copy of the book around. It's not the final version; it's the corrected proof, as they say. The final thing should hit the bookstores soon. The online goes away. So just a very little background for those of you who may not know much about ancient sports.
This is Greece.
Greece. And you see here the Olympia, it's like the original Olympic Games, which you know an awful lot about, written about in great detail. There's the fight in Olympia, which we will do today. The Greeks practiced their sports in honor of the gods, and we find the same kind of athletic idealization in figures of the gods, like Zeus here, who is portrayed as an athlete fighting against one of the giants. The title of our book is Agony, which is obviously a play on the word agon, which really is a defining term in Greek culture. Because it means every kind of struggle, debate, argument, dialogue that you could possibly engage in the words of Socrates there, contest not only of speed and strength, but also of words, opinion, and all other activities.
And of course, agony is a central component of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So
Yes,
it fits in really well.
it certainly is. I can testify to this from very, very limited experience.
I caught David in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
That it looks pretty innocent, even boring to the outsider.
Yeah.
But within the first 10 seconds, you realize that that's really rather deceptive. And we'll talk a little bit here today about Plato's cave, because the sort of journey from the false impression of what this sport involves to the reality is an analogous to just before we sort of go a little further, I must thank one of our former classic students and gym owner and combat practitioner with many medals and trophies to his name, Corey Johnson, very kindly has allowed me to go to his gym, watch, be trained a little bit, and also to ask lots and lots of questions. And Corey himself is a very interesting figure. He likes classics a lot. And I often call his gym Socrates' gym or Plato's gym. He is trying to inculcate a kind of classical Greek ethos.
Well, he was a classic major.
In the fact major, and he has designed shirts and so on for his students. So in the west of Texas, right, in Lubbock, is a very uninspiring location. They managed to put together this team, like-minded individuals, and so I would like to really thank Mr. Johnson for the help he's given us here. I learned a lot simply from observing. One of our arguments today will be that practicing jiu-jitsu is not just a physical exercise, it's also mental one. And of course, that's something that we also recognize. So this is our book, and what we do in here is illustrated by some pictures from the British Museum, but also by artwork from artist who works at the publisher that we deal with. His name is Jeremy Smith. And he has been able to render for us ideas that obviously we couldn't find ancient sources for. And this has really added a great deal to the project. That as well. So it's about the return to the Palestra and how you can experience this by going to any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We also talk about mixed martial arts. But that's less of our focus, I think, than Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So,
Correct, yeah. And of course, the Palestra was the place where you wouldn't just experience wrestling or boxing, or their form of kickboxing. You would experience philosophical debates or lectures, maybe poetry readings. So it was a place where arts and culture met with a more martial practice as well. And so for us, well, David and I, but also those of us who practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, almost unconsciously, naturally, it has developed into a kind of palestra because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a more intellectual sport. It requires a little bit more, I'd say, a lot more thinking throughout, as well as physicality. It unconsciously blends those elements together. So that is our main contention in this book.
and what we're really suggesting is that if you look at Greek wrestling, which is illustrated here, which was basically not ground-based. It's an upright form of wrestling. You did have to throw your opponent to get the shoulders on the ground 3 times to win a match, but it wasn't based on the ground. If you combine Greek wrestling with the pancration, which was a sport that the Greeks developed themselves out of a combination of wrestling and boxing, you get much closer to what we're talking about in the modern context. Pan in Greek means all. Prat is the word of power. Use, who you saw earlier there, is pankrates, all powerful. The pankration was a kind of all-in struggle, where you would use whatever methods you could, including striking, but also limb twisting or breaking, and also taking the fight down to the ground in order to defeat your opponent or force him to submit. There were no rounds or controls really in ancient Greek combat. You just kept going until your opponent gave up, or I suppose mortally wounded, couldn't continue. So, and we've looked at a lot of these illustrations, and particularly some of the Roman ones, which are later, do provide some evidence of moves which are relatively familiar.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you're dealing with the same bodies, and so inevitably you're going to come up against the same techniques that have been repeated throughout time. And so you can see here 2 examples of techniques that we practice for submitting one's opponent that you can see replicated in modern mixed martial arts, and with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in particular. What you might have over here would be called a calf slicer, where the pressure is put on both the joint of the knee as well as the calf by applying one's leg to the center. And then you have the kind of shoulder manipulation in the right.
And here you have a pancreas indicating that he's surrendering or tapping out.
Right. Where of course you have now.
Yes. So this is basically our proposal. In one direction, you would head towards MMA, in the other, towards Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and in particular here, the analogies that you find with things like the Socratic method, so resonances in the Greek mythology, drum. So, oh, it would give us the lead in. This is what we're going to discuss. This is an ordinary Friday evening. I was forward to
we've omitted the sound because while intellectual discussions do take place. Also quite a lot of it.
Yeah, I think actually we're already at that point.
Probably,
Suffering
yeah.
quite a lot.
Yeah. Oftentimes we're
The
vocal,
long air.
you know.
Yeah. Okay, so this is our artist's representation of the combination of musicae and gymnasticae, the two elements of creation. Realm of the muses, which includes song, poetry, and gymnasticae, which is the participant side, and running throughout the book in sort of conjunction with Joshua's own experience. I mean, it's really quite unusual, I find, to have run across someone who actually combines poetry. And
This is where I get very uncomfortable.
but I think, well, that's why I'm being
Yeah.
cautious of what I say. Someone who writes poetry and does combat sports to a pretty high level. Yeah, you can imagine my surprise when this was made apparent.
What was always fascinating to me with speaking of the gymnasticae and the musicae, is that I never wanted to limit, excuse me, myself to one interest. In our contemporary culture, it's easy to divide, and it's oftentimes divided, maybe more in American culture. I don't know how it is in Canada, but I know growing up where I was, there were, and if you'll excuse the phrasing, these are my father's words, the city sports or the city pursuits that could be like soccer or perhaps the more feminine arts that were discouraged in my household, or there were the more masculine, like you could play football. Right? It was always American football, and this dichotomy between what is more feminine or weaker versus what is more masculine and manly, like football, of course, is always the American example, was a vein that was running through my own life and what I found also in our culture, our contemporary culture, and especially in American culture. And so what fascinated me was something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu combines those together. And upon doing further research, of course, into the life of the Greeks, that this idea that these two things were separate was unheard of for the Greeks. Right? And I remember the first time reading the Iliad and realizing that Achilles wept. For me, that was something that was extremely profound. That he wept and he played the lyre, he wrote poetry, and he also killed everyone. So that was a fascination for me, and as I became older, I decided that I was no longer going to be constrained by these artificial restrictions, and I found that there were other people also who had like-minded interests. And so I was talking to David actually in my class the other night. What's so fascinating about jiu-jitsu in my class the other night, when we opened that at the gym where I go to in Clemson, there were 9 of us there. 2 of us had PhDs, and 1 of them was working on it. Out of the 9 people. And then the other coach was a professional fighter, and then of course we had other folks there as well who were not in academia. But this diversity of thought, intellectual pursuits, was what I found most interesting, and also, of course, the oldest tradition of excellence found in the Greeks. So, yeah.
I'm sorry that PowerPoint is not coming out quite right in terms of the size of the.
This is our southern way of saying southern. You need to get southern.
So one of the early chapters called Your Initiation. Would you like to talk a little bit about this?
Sure, I can. Yeah. So when I was younger, I ran cross country. That was my sport. I rebelled entirely against the football, basketball, baseball, mostly because I wasn't good at them. And so, it became easy to rebel against them. But I ran cross country, and so for me, the idea of long suffering or dolichos in Greek was something that was near and dear to my heart. In fact, I cherished the ability to outrun others or outlast others. And I had a gas tank, I had cardio. And so for me, that was something that was especially precious growing up, especially since my brother was much bigger than I was. And so if I could outrun him, that was very satisfying. Of course, I was not physically. You mentioned earlier jiu-jitsu being for the smaller. I used to be much smaller. I used to be much smaller. I used to be about 40 pounds lighter. And so when I first started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that was my motivation, was to be smaller, outlast my opponents, and gain victory that way. My experience also was, of course, through cross country, individual sports. So unlike the American predilection towards team sports, I was interested in the individual, what the individual could do. Nominally a part of the team, but mostly through one's own long suffering, what you could accomplish. When I was playing baseball, I was always in right field or left field and just hanging out and picking grass and daisies from the field. But when I was running cross country, I actually had to show up. I had to work. Okay? So that's where this initial chapter, this is our first chapter, that's where it stems from. This is a great illustration from Jeremy, our artist. There are any number of analogies for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but one of them is that it's like fighting a 200-pound Rubik's Cube, which is also fighting there. And so trying to solve that problem of your opponent is the central agony of Jiu-Jitsu, because they are also trying to solve you as a problem. Yes.
This was one of those illustrations that took me by surprise because Jeremy read the manuscript and I had asked him to do a few basic things like, can you show me like a chimera, like a sort of jiu-jitsu fight. I thought that was a stretch, but he read through and he came up with this. He's really very, very capable. So, moving on to another rule that we have in the book, the platonic angle. You might want to say something about nicknames here.
Yeah, so another chapter we have is about nicknames. I won't go into too much of that, but I was having always been fascinated by the classics. I was even before I practiced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I was fascinated by a little fun fact, which many of you probably already know, but I still geek out about all the time, which is the fact that Plato was not even his real name. And so Plato, being a philosopher, before he was a philosopher, before he was this aged, wise man, was a wrestler, like every Greek male youth. He was a wrestler, and he was a good wrestler. And so Plato, coming from Greek Platon, means broad-shouldered. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but yes, meaning broad-shouldered. So essentially, Plato was his wrestling name, which I was fascinated by. That someone like Plato, and this was when I was 18, 19 years old, I was fascinated by the fact that somebody like Plato, so wise, the founder of Western philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, could also just kick the shit out of it. I thought it was great. So, but this out of the cave, going along with, I won't go into nicknames, but this out of the cave chapter that we've written is, of course, the allegory of the cave. So if anybody's not familiar with the allegory of the cave, the gist of it is there are these folks trapped in the cave. They've been there all their lives. We have this, I love the monkey with the hat illustration there. We have this monkey who's projecting these shapes onto the cave wall. And of course, to these people who are in the cave, that's their reality. And eventually this person is dragged out of the cave, as you can see here, into the light, where they must accustom themselves to reality. Now, combat sports is a kind of dragging oneself out of the cave and into reality, because you quickly discover what you are and are not capable of. I think there's an anecdote I mentioned in this chapter you're familiar with The Onion? I don't know if that's still around as a satirical. I feel like I should source myself, but, there was a great Onion article that says local man, 4,000% more confident that he could, that he could win a street fight than he actually is able. And so there's an implicit belief within every person that they would be able to defend themselves in a physical altercation. And in reality, what we find out when you begin to practice combat sports is that it's actually not as easy as you might think it is. I remember thinking the first time I got grabbed hold of, and so David, I'm going to use you as an example here. The first time somebody grabbed hold of me, I remember thinking, I'm only getting out of this if they choose to let me out. There's no getting away. Right? And that for me was a huge wake-up call. That was a huge wake-up call. There were people capable of great violence, or great restraint, depending on their mood. But Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu acts as this kind of coming out of the cave moment. And that's one of the reasons why, too, there are so few people who make it to the higher ranks of the tiered belt system, because they quit. Because oftentimes reality is too much.
What stage do they stop usually?
Typically, they don't make it to the movie, so then most people quit after a few months. That's also one of the reasons why they quit.
I mean, this is really an accurate representation of what it suddenly feels like when you're no longer in the original illusory state.
Tell them about the time that you asked me to go all out.
Well, I was really curious, and
what does this feel like if you're not holding back?
yeah, stupidly, I asked. I think that's the first time actually. It was, and I said, because he was talking about, well, I'm not really doing much pressure. We were kind of going to be there. And stupidly, even at the age of 63, I said, what would that feel like if you were really doing something? And within like 2 seconds, I had this pain in my throat. I'm like, stop.
And I never heard the end of it, by the way. Even though he asked for it, I never heard the end.
Well, because I got home and the pain wouldn't go. I thought something had been damaged, and then I thought I was going to have to go to my doctor and tell her that I had injured myself doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and deal with what she would then say to me. So I was really anxious and annoyed for about 5 days. I went away.
Yeah, I'm trying to save this text message.
But it was not a pleasant experience. But even that behind, we should say a little bit about the Socratic dialogue, which we also talk about in connection with Plato, because we've often talked about how Jiu-Jitsu is dialogic. It is like a physical dialogue. There's one move followed by another one, a sort of reaction each time. And
yeah, so there was a quote, there's a famous quote, there's a member of the Gracie family, I don't remember which one. It starts with an R and sounds like Julio or something. I don't know, there's so many. But at one point, somebody asked him, what is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu essentially? You can boil it down. And he said, you move, I move, you move, I move, forever. And in an ideal world, there would be a move, counter move, counter move, forever. So it is, and oftentimes when you read the Republic, it feels like forever.
yeah, very much like that irritating aspect of Socratic philosophy.
Right, it just goes on and on and on. Yeah. So somebody literally just taps out and leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you never hear from them.
And Socrates just goes on. And the experience is very frustrating. It is actually extremely complicated. Yeah, I remember being taught a sequence of things to do. And it's very, very difficult
And then having to remember them in a live role when somebody's trying to kill you.
I was struck by how hard it was to remember almost anything. I'm sure you would testify.
That's great, I love the
We also have a chapter on death and rebirth, which takes the hero's journey, because the whole narrative is in a way structured on that model. And heroes, as you know, go to the underworld and come back. One of our very early analogies or points of contact was between that departure to the realm of the dead and the experience of being choked out, right?
Yeah, whether you literally pass out from a choke submission, or whether you tap, which is of course the universal sign for quitting. Joe Rogan actually made this interesting point, one of his few, but he made an interesting point that tapping out is like admitting I have died. You have killed me. Because if you were to continue to hold this choke, I would die. And so when you tap, you admit that either I have died or I have suffered catastrophic damage from a joint lock or what have you. And so this death and rebirth metaphor has been central to our discussion from the very beginning.
Yes, and it arose actually from the discourse, because I remember you came into the office one day very early on and said, "So what did you do last week?" And said, "Right, you know, I killed a couple of people at the gym." And I thought, oh, that's very interesting that it would be put that way. And there is, in fact, in the sport, a separate discourse, this kind of thing.
And then, of course, what happens to the hero when they come back? They are wiser, they've grown, matured, maybe.
I suppose you learn not to be caught in the same.
Yeah, you learn, that's essentially it, right? You learn from your mistakes, hopefully.
So here's somebody who is about to be
Something, either go unconscious or
dispatched to the underworld.
And the folks who name techniques and routines are not particularly intuitive, and so this is called a triangle choke because it makes a triangle.
But there are more interesting names.
There are some interesting names.
Then we have a chapter called The Good, the Bad, and the Stranger. Most of the chapter titles on Joshua's, because they're good at picking up titles. So this came from a conversation I asked him questions about what's it like going to an unfamiliar gym,
Which I will be doing tomorrow. So, no, so it started off as a conversation about going into unfamiliar territory, especially when the stakes are so high, because I can name, on one hand, I can count the times when I've been severely injured, and all of those have been when I was visiting a gym that I've never been to. I blew up my knee multiple times. Yeah. Well, I didn't. Other. Yeah. On this one occasion, though, that sparked this chapter, I had just gotten back from Venice. I've been in Venice for 2 weeks, just getting fat and out of shape and not working out at all. And it was amazing, and just drinking a lot, and it was awesome. It was so great that I decided I was going to. I was feeling large and in charge, literally, and I decided on the layover back from Venice in Philly, feeling pretty industrious, I think I'll go to a local gym and see what their culture is like. I also just placed third place. I had gotten third place in the world championship, and so I thought I was pretty hot shit at the time. And so, of course, humility was right around the corner, as it always is with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I walk into this gym full of sharks. Just sharks can't lick their lips, but if they could, these sharks would be licking their lips. And I just got ragged up for an hour, and it was horrible. And I felt like quitting. I've been doing it for years, and I got destroyed by these folks who trained multiple times per day. And I was so out of shape, and it made me think, though, it made me think of this chapter in particular, the politics of going into a new place. And how might that tie into stories we know from ancient Greece? Right? You want to take it over from there?
Well, and our analogy was the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Obviously, where
And who better?
and who better than Odysseus? There is that moment where he reveals himself to the suitors at the end and kills them all. But there are a couple of other scenes too, where he disguise earlier on when he's dressed as a beggar, he ends up in a sort of unexpected brawl because he's sort of forced into it.
We call these, I like to call these moments the oh shit moments.
Yeah, when he reveals himself to the suitors at the doors are barred, that's the oh shit.
Yeah. I had one the other day, I told you about. I was at the gym and the person who was talking trash to me didn't know that I was a brown belt and said, "Hey, you don't come very often, do you?" And I said, "No, I've got school, this, that, and the other." And I said, "Hey, you enroll, by the way." And he regretted his decision. So, yeah, there is an oh shit moment that works both ways. Somebody reveals themselves.
Yes, and then this chapter sort of gradually expanded into a sort of much larger discussion about the trickster in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I think I said to you one time, could we call it the trickster sport? Because it seems to have wrote the trickster archetype, but obviously we found it. But this is Jeremy Smith's sort of representation of the blinding of the Cyclops. We have another chapter called A Poke in the Eye, which was
Always like a poke in my eye.
was inspired by his getting poked in the eye one weekend and coming in with a bandage. And I immediately thought of the Cyclops.
I don't understand
So we decided we would designate Odysseus as the trickster.
Well, of course, and how does he beat Ajax in the wrestling match? Through trickery. Yeah. And jiu-jitsu is the trickster sport. You had mentioned earlier, I don't know your name, but I learned it after this, that you wanted to do jiu-jitsu because you were the smaller guy. Jiu-jitsu uses leverage, it uses proper technique, knowledge of the human body to be able to give the advantage to the smaller person. Elio, a little history lesson, Elio Gracie, the founder of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was small, he was a sickly child. His brothers were all bigger than him, and they were practicing judo, which requires strength and size. But Elio was very smart. He sat on the sidelines and he learned how to use leverage. He developed Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from watching judo and turning it into his faith. So Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of course, is the trickster sport. And here you see a heel hook, which is, it's a phenomenon in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so you wouldn't know anything about it, but it has been a relatively recent phenomenon. This technique has taken hold and it has leveled the playing field, so to speak, because one cannot strengthen the tendons in one's knees. You can only do so much protecting against the heel. Yes. Right. Whereas, of course, if you are in an arm bar or something, you can muscle out of it. This, however, negates strength altogether.
Yeah, or some people don't like it for that reason.
And some people don't like it for that reason because it's a kind of cheating.
So when you roll with Corey, who's much larger,
I would go for heel hooks. Yeah, I'm not gonna try and mess with him. Corey's huge.
right? Exactly.
How do I do that?
And this was another instance where I did actually ask what it's like, but I said, like 1 millimeter.
Well, the rough thing about heel hooks too is you don't feel pain before you
Yeah.
blow out your knee.
So I sort of learned my lesson from the previous mistake. Then we have a chapter on catastrophe. And this is really connected with the moment of the turn of the tire in the Greek tragedy, where events suddenly change. There's a instantaneous.
You talk about the meaning of the word?
Yes, and catastrophe sort of throwing down. And that's also accompanied by repetition in drama. This was something I was quizzing Joshua about this. I think you had some examples at the time where you had, have that moment of verify. And I had seen it in Corey's gym. I had seen situations where somebody was doing very well, and suddenly, all of a sudden, not so much. That was, all of a sudden it was completely different. So there is this sort of dramatic thrill to the whole thing. You know, get that.
Well, that's the humility aspect of it as well, is that anybody can lose at any time. And the better you are, of course, the less likely you are to get caught, so to speak. But that's where it differs. So I started off as a boxer, and that's where it differs primarily from boxing, is that in boxing, it's very unlikely that the smaller person is going to beat the larger person. There are weight classes for a reason. You get hit by somebody who's much larger than you, probably going to take a toll on you. And there's very little you can do to mitigate that damage. However, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that is not the case. And also in boxing, there are only so many punches you can throw, as opposed to Jiu-Jitsu, where there are literally hundreds of different techniques depending on your position. And so anyone can lose at any time.
Of course, we used Oedipus as the sort of case study for this, and that was inspirational in a way, because Oedipus has to solve a riddle. He talks about sort of riddling nature of jiu-jitsu.
Exactly, right. Goes back to the Rubik's Cube, trying to solve the Rubik's Cube.
Yes. And then we were looking at this figure of the Sphinx. Of course, this is sort of hybrid creature with multiple elements attached, and that took us in a different direction. I very much wanted Jeremy to sort of take that the crouching picture of the Sphinx there. It always looked vaguely threatening to me, like the Sphinx was going to jump down and like try to eat or kill Oedipus, whereas he's sitting there very calm and collected, not afraid at all, apparently. And then Jeremy came up with this sort of a very nice representation of the MMA fight. Was that John Jones? Yeah. So these are the kind of things we've been exploring.
And I don't think I think it's an unconscious. I certainly don't think John Jones looked at the Sphinx and said, "This is a great model for my pop through the octagon." But I think it is an unconscious thread that we're trying to uncover, running through combat sports. This Grecian thread that has been covered over through the years, lost maybe at times, but still persists in our culture.
Yes, and I also think that the ubiquity of combat sports in Greek society makes its way into a myth and mythical representations, and that's a sort of separate area that we've begun to study. Starting to do the book, but we'll probably continue with that.
Along with your jiu-jitsu lesson.
Right. Then we have a chapter on trophies. Would you like to?
Sure, I have a few. So it's sort of sparked off, I guess. I used to live in a very tiny apartment, so when I was doing my PhD, and so everything was just all in one room. But right when you walk into my house, there is a ladder that I got from I don't know, some department store. My mother picked it out, and on that ladder are all of my trophies. I wrapped them up into the rungs of the ladder, hung them off, whatever. I gotta get a new ladder suit, but for now I've got that one. It's in my office now. And but of course, where does the term trophy come from? It comes from the tropeion, the tree that the victorious army would hang the armor of their defeated foes from. And so that sort of sparked this this chapter. You can actually see it just there. Yes, in the background. Yeah.
There's the fact when I think it's really awesome.
Great.
Yeah, as I said, we have been exploring representations of mythical creatures, and one of the things we sort of hit on fairly early was these figures in Greek myth who are multi-limbed. For instance, in Hesiod, you have the 100-handers. And I think we just sort of started wondering about what the inspiration for those might be and how it could be the representation perhaps of the experience of different limbs coming at you.
Well, there are the 100-handers, there's the centaurs, there are octopuses on the shields that you can see.
Yeah.
So there is a fascination with multi-limbed creatures.
And we were looking at the role of the centaurs and the lapids, because on the Parthenon frieze, for example, you do see these kinds of representations, which are not directly sort of pancration, but there are similar kinds of moves here. I managed to get Jeremy to produce a lapid heel hooking the center. That's something that we had imagined, right? How it would be grappling with the bodies and the centaur. It's a bit like the Rubik's Cube, because it's an impossible opponent, right? There's so much going on.
Yeah. But it also presents opportunities, because with more limbs come more things that you can attack.
Yeah, more vulnerability.
More vulnerability.
Yeah. I was sort of poking around in the classics library over the summer, trying to find out more about the centaurs and what happens, because I just thought that there had to be some kind of evidence that the Greeks might have thought of this in terms of pancration, like that. And there's one sort of grainy image that floats around on the web, which a lot of Jiu-Jitsu enthusiasts say, look, it just shows you that the ancients were aware of the heel hook. But nobody ever cites the source for it and actually manages to track it down this summer. It's a Roman sarcophagus. And I did say earlier at the beginning that sometimes the Romans provide, this Roadmap provides images for us. And so this is actually the scene that's involved. And then as I was sort of looking further, I discovered that there's also this, which I think you would
It's a figure 4 month, yeah.
So
Or Kimura.
we do have more Kimura, yeah. So we do actually appear to have actual source material which would tend to confirm some of the categories which would suggest. So those are a few of the chapters in the book. Finding the kind of so if you have any questions, Joshua is probably the person best capable of answering anything to do with the combat side.
I feel like I've taught you enough at this point.
No, because just before we came here, I put something on the PowerPoint, which would have been very embarrassing. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all. Yes.